classmates. Thanks for coming and checking out my blog post. Today we're going to talk about the Dick and Carey instructional framework. I really think the best way to unpackage this might be to look at another more popular instructional framework that is a bit more general in its approach and is used in many different sectors, including product development and also education. And that's the ADDIE process. The ADDIE process is an acronym that stands for Analyze, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. This is a circular process. First starting with evaluating your instructional needs, then designing the instructional material, developing that instructional material, and then finding effective ways to implement it, and then always evaluating the process, going right back to analyzing those instructional needs. So the Dick and Carey process is very similar to this, but it's just more in depth and actually more specific towards training or education. So the very first stage in the Dick and Carey instructional framework is developing your instructional goals. To put simply, this is what you want your students to be able to do. So we're gonna walk through this whole entire process, and to do so, we're going to take something that I deal with as an analogy to kind of walk through. So as a music teacher, I want my students to learn all 12 major scales. So now that we have established that as an instructional goal, we need to move on to stage 2, and that is conducting an instructional analysis. Basically, I'm determining the skills that my students need to have to be able to learn what it is that I want them to do. So I want them to learn all 12 major scales. Well then, I probably need them to be able to play, first off, their chromatic scale. In other words, I need them to know all their fingerings, because we're going to get into some key signatures that have a lot of sharps and flats, and if they don't know those notes, we're going to have a hard time learning all 12 major scales. After I've done my instructional analysis, I need to look at the entry behaviors and my student characteristics. So if I have the goal for my students to learn all 12 major scales, well, what type of students do I have? Am I talking about my 6th grade beginning band students? Because that's going to be shooting for the moon. Or is it going to be my high school students, where it's far more appropriate for them to reach that goal? And then also I need to take into account that, okay, it's my high school students. They should be able to do this. But what was the preparation that brought them there from middle school? I need to keep that into account as the characteristic of these learners. What is their background? So then that way I can make sure that later down the process, I'm keeping that in mind in building my instructional material. Now that we have all those considerations, since we can move on to writing the performance objectives. Now the performance objectives need to be specific. Saying I want my students to learn all 12 major scales is just simply not enough. Do I want them to learn all 12 major scales in the first week? Is it allowable for them to play it as slow as possible? Is it just one octave that I want them to play? Do they need to play 2 octaves? So a good performance objective is very specific. So we want to start with students will be able to do. So for our purposes, for the 12 major scales, I might say in quarter 1, students will be able to play concert B flat, concert E flat, concert F at quarter note equals 120 beats per minute at 95% accuracy. That's giving my students and everyone involved in the process a very clear understanding as to what I expect. After the performance objectives are in place, it's on to writing some tests. In this case, we want to make sure that our tests are criterion reference test items. We want to make sure that the benchmark is established for all students to meet. Now this is where we might vary a little bit in terms of our analogy with the 12 major scales. In all reality, with the 12 major scales, I might opt for a more of a rubric-based assessment. That's not to say that it's not criterion reference, but it is a little bit more difficult to make that criterion reference because a rubric can be a little bit more subjective than a simple, you got the answer right or you got the answer wrong. So as best as we possibly can, we want it to be criterion reference test items. Once we have the test in place, so we're basically getting the test there, and now it's time to create the instructional strategies that are going to point towards that test. The instructional strategies is really where the rubber hits the road. How are we going to get students from point A to point B? In our analogy with the 12 major scales, obviously we can play the scales, but there's so much more that we can do. There's countless exercises that we can put on the table and have our students play through in order for them to get familiar with playing in those keys. There's also etudes, which are basically musical exercises. They're basically songs with purposeful exercise points built inside of them. Also, for my concert prep, as I build what we're going to perform in our concert, I can be mindful of the scales that we are working on and making sure that those scales are represented in the repertoire that we're preparing for. As we move on to stage 7, we're keeping in mind all the instructional materials that we need in order to pull this off. In our case with the 12 major scales, it can be very minimal, but it can also be much more complex. There's plenty of published material out there that are specific just to learning your 12 major scales. And so keeping those into considerations, what sort of method book am I going to use that's going to help us get to our desired goal? Once we have all these pieces in place, we begin to do an evaluation process. And we have 2 evaluations that we look at. In step 8 and step 9, we have the formative evaluation and a summative evaluation. Now, this is very similar language that we have in education when we talk about assessing students. We have formative assessments, summative assessments. But in this case, we're not looking at student performance per se. We are looking at the instructional design's ability to effectively get students to the goal that we have on hand for them. A lot of the language is the same though. So a formative evaluation is something that is happening and ongoing. With that process, there's a revision that we look at all those steps as we go, and we're revising. And we're taking that all the way back to our instructional evaluation, making sure that all the items that we have in place are meeting that instructional evaluation. At the end of the entire process, we are going to do a summative evaluation to look over the whole entire lesson and see, man, these items right here worked brilliantly. A few of the items right here didn't quite work out very well, and they need to be revised. I would suggest that we're careful not to just pluck things out when we see that students don't respond very well to them. You will hardly ever have a class that loves absolutely everything that you put in front of them. You're always going to have grumblers. You're always going to have students that will begrudgingly follow you where you lead them. And so we need to be careful that we're evaluating things off of their instructional merit, because it's a grander picture here in the summative evaluation. We're looking at how well does this repeat for generations to come. It's important in that summative evaluation that we take it back to the behaviors and student characteristics. In other words, to ask the question, is the whole entire process that we created just way too much for this particular group of students? Or The other way is what was created here way too easy for these students. You got to take it back to those behaviors and student characteristics to make sure that the whole entire lesson really is appropriate for the intended audience that you're building it for. So that's the Dick and Carey instructional framework. You can see that there are some clear similarities to the ADDIE process. Thank you so much for checking this out, and I look forward to seeing your guys' videos. Thank you.